Yuval, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to all of you. Thank you for attending this session. I think clearly this topic of unity at a time of sort of prolonged divisions in our country is something that we're all very, I think, concerned and interested about, wherever you are in the political spectrum. And you've written what you call a book about America, which is by definition a hopeful book. And so I think we're all looking, no matter where you are politically over the past administrations and things, we all want hope. We all want unity. So talk to us about why you wrote this book and why it is a hopeful book and what you hope for this audience to sort of come away with today.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. And it's really a tremendous honor to be part of the National Book Festival and to be part of anything that the Library of Congress does. So I'm just very grateful to be here. This book is it's a kind of reintroduction to the Constitution through the lens of national unity and cohesion. And I think this is an important time to become reacquainted with the Constitution in that way for a couple of reasons. First of all, we are, as you say, in a divided time, and we're looking for help on that front. And I think oftentimes we incline to think of the Constitution as part of the problem, as one of the things that divides us. We argue a lot about the Constitution. But I think when you actually look at that document and step back from it and ask yourself, what is the question to which this is an answer? What are the problems to which this offers solutions? A lot of what it offers us has to do with the challenge of unity, with the desire for cohesion. And so the primary reason for me to take up this book is to see and show how important the challenge of unity in a diverse society was to the authors of the Constitution. And in that sense, to see how valuable the Constitution could be to us as we think through that problem now. The challenge of disunity, even I would say the threat, the danger of civil war, was very much on the minds of the authors of the Constitution. We don't often think about the document in those terms now, but they did. When the Constitution explains its purpose in the preamble, the first thing it says is that it exists to form a more perfect union. If you look at the Federalist Papers, the set of arguments made by several of the authors of the Constitution on its behalf, the first third or so of the Federalist essays are about the need for unity and union. And all of the institutions created by the Constitution, in one way or another, are there to advance the cause of greater national cohesion. It's not their only purpose, obviously, but it is a core and fundamental purpose of all of them. I think we've lost sight of that, and in losing sight of that, we've lost some of our practice of constitutionalism. And when we now ask ourselves, how could we be more unified, we don't often think the Constitution has an answer to that question, but it really does. It offers us a definition of unity that could be useful now, and a set of modes of action that could help us get there. I think recovering those is really valuable now, and that's what the book offers. It's a reacquaintance with the Constitution on those terms.
So let's talk about what the founders were up to and maybe set the stage for what was on their mind at that time. You talk about, sort of obviously coming out of the Revolutionary War, time of war, and the divisions that existed. Clearly one of the purposes we're all familiar with in creating the Constitution would be to set the framework for government, the division between the branches to protect and enumerate the rights of the citizens. Obviously the Bill of Rights came shortly thereafter, and sort of that's, when we think of the Constitution, we think of sort of those concepts. And you lay that out in your book. You talk about sort of the 5 structures of the Constitution, and the one that you really spend the time building out is the unity portion of that. Talk about what the framers were up to at that point, what sort of the different debates were, and maybe how that contrasts with sort of other documents around the world at that time.
This is a really important question because I think we easily lose sight of the set of questions to which the Constitution was meant to be an answer. We think of the Constitution primarily as law, and it is law. And I would say it is first and foremost law, and it calls itself the supreme law of the land. But the Constitution is not only law, and it was not created because there was a shortage of law in the early republic. It was created because there was a shortage of functional government in the early republic. What drove the framers to come together and redraw the framework of government was dysfunction in American government in the wake of the Revolutionary War. They had been, in the 10 years before the Constitution, through 5 years of war and 5 years of peace. And the 5 years of war taught them about the dangers of centralized power. So they were concerned about the power the king had had over them. They didn't want a new king. They were concerned about the strengths of government. But the 5 years of peace that followed the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 were very chaotic and dysfunctional. There was mass inflation in all the states. There was lawlessness. There was mob rule. There was political violence. And those years taught Americans that they needed a functional government. They didn't want an overbearing government, but they did want a functional government. And the framers come into the process of creating the Constitution with an eye to finding that balance. That moment was very unusual, and I don't think the Constitution could have been written at any other moment in American history than after those 5 years of war and 5 years of peace, when they saw why they needed government and why they needed to limit government. And the Constitution does both things. So it is first and foremost law. That is the right way to think about it. But it is also, as a secondary matter, a framework for public policy, that is, for government that works. So law creates boundaries, public policy framework creates powers, and the Constitution is both boundaries and powers. It's also a framework of institutions. The Constitution creates a set of new and really genuinely novel institutions. The US Congress, a national legislature, the presidency, which was brand new. There had never before been a Republican executive at the national level in history. The American presidency was a new idea. It creates a set of courts. It creates a system of federalism. These are institutional structures so that they allow power to flow through our system in particular ways. There are certain things that a legislature does. There are other things that a president does. They're not the same. Somebody ought to tell our Congress and our president that today, but they're not the same. And you never know where the applause lines are going to be in the Constitution. I think it is very important to recognize these institutional structures. The Constitution is also, in a fundamental sense, a political framework. It establishes the character, the personality of the American polity and the sort of framework of American political life. And finally, it is a framework for unity. It's a way to hold together a very diverse and divided society. The United States in 1787 was already larger than any of the European nations. And none of them really were democratic in the way that the Americans wanted their society to be. They were doing something new and very difficult. And the problem they faced was similar to the one we face. They had a very diverse and divided society, and they needed somehow to hold it together. And to do that, they arrived at an understanding of what unity could look like in a diverse society that I think is still very valuable to us, and at a set of practices and institutions to make that happen that we could really learn from again.
So certainly in the Constitution, ultimately the majority of people vote, they elect folks to represent them in their opinion, and that majority will has to govern. But the framers are very concerned about majoritarianism, talking about a muscular majoritarianism that sort of this 50% plus one philosophy, you know, you win, you control the government. And so when they laid out the Constitution, one, I think it's fascinating that they were thinking about so many future challenges that could exist and those tensions, and thinking, how could this document create a framework that could last through the years of time, right? What were the structures they put in place? And you also talk a lot about sort of James Madison, right? Yeah. Sort of the Federalist Papers and what he was promoting. What were those structures they put in place, and sort of what is that concept of sort of protecting minority rights while allowing majority will to proceed?
Yeah, Madison is really a central player here. Madison is my favorite of the framers. Maybe it's because he's not a lawyer, and all the rest of them pretty much are. I love lawyers, and some of my favorite people are lawyers. My wife is a lawyer. But, you know, the framers of the Constitution were almost all lawyers. James Madison was a politician. And he was proud of it. Every job he ever had, he didn't even pretend to be a farmer like so many of the Virginians did. He was a politician. Every job he had was elected or appointed. And he thought about politics through the lens of citizenship more than of law. And the problem that they approached had everything to do with this question of unity we're discussing here. Madison approaches politics with a distinct definition of unity that I think we could really learn from. Because, you know, a lot of people in our politics now talk about unity, but when they talk about unity, they basically mean if everybody agreed with me, then everything would be great. And that's true. I believe that if everybody agreed with me, everything would be great. But it's also not going to happen. And James Madison uniquely begins from the premise that that is not going to happen. He says bluntly in Federalist 10, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. Get any group of people together. Anybody who's ever done a group project knows this is true. Get any group of people together. If they're allowed to have their own opinions, they will not have the same opinion. And so diversity is a reality in a free society. But for Madison, this didn't mean we couldn't be a unified society. It didn't mean we couldn't agree with each other where it mattered. Because unity, and this I think is the crucial definition for us for today, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the difference between thinking alike and acting together is really crucial to think through. It is possible to act together when you don't think alike. Obviously, to say that, to state it bluntly, raises the question, how? How are you supposed to act together when you don't think alike? I think the United States Constitution is a set of answers to that question. How are you supposed to act together when you don't think alike? The answer is Congress, the answer is the executive, the answer is the courts, the answer is federalism. And it is the answer in a distinct way for each of those. This is how the book works. It works through those institutions trying to think through, how is this part of that answer? Now, the point you make is very crucial to Madison and the framers, because there's a simple-minded way to answer that question. How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? Just take a vote and do whatever the majority wants. Now, votes are important, and majority rule is the only legitimate way to govern a democracy, to govern a society, I think. But the framers understood what any observer of any democracy understands. Democracy is ruled by the majority. Majorities are the source of legitimacy, but majorities can also be very oppressive of minorities. And the challenge you face is how to act together when you don't think alike, while also balancing majority rule and minority rights. That is the challenge the Constitution rose to meet. It's a very complicated challenge, and for that reason, the Constitution is a very complicated structure. Almost everything about the Constitution that frustrates us now, or that we just find mysterious, why do we do it like this? Almost all of that is there in order to find this balance, to not just let majorities run roughshod over minorities, but also not to let minorities run things, which is illegitimate. So what do? We force narrow majorities to grow. We force coalition building. We slow things down. We prefer legitimacy to efficiency. The American system is distinct in this way. It is not like the parliamentary democracies that you find in most of the democratic world. Those are legitimate too, but they're solving a different problem. The fundamental problem the American system is meant to solve is the challenge of disunity in a diverse society. And I think if we allowed it to work in the way that it was designed to work, it would really help us address that problem now. But we've lost sight of what that way is, of why it works this way. We just find it frustrating. We try to push it down, and we don't see what it is we're trampling as we do it.
What are a few examples of, so this Constitution gets drafted, Madison's philosophy is somewhat successful, and there's a lot of compromises. We all know about things like the Connecticut Compromise and different portions of this. And so this isn't a document in which everyone agreed. It almost exemplifies what you're talking about,
Absolutely.
right? Not everyone agreed, but they were sort of forced in that room to sort of come up with a solution or not exist as a country. And so everyone kind of there was a give and take, and this document goes forward. What were some of those structures that were placed into the Constitution that were there to enact sort of that protection against strong majoritarianism?
So at the very center of the constitutional system is Congress. This is good news and bad news, as we all know. But at the very center is Congress, because Congress is the venue for acting together when we don't think alike. It's a venue for bargaining, for deal-making, for negotiating. And Congress is at the center of the Constitution's answer to the question, how do we do this? Congress is a very unusual legislature because it's not simply majoritarian. It's divided and divided and divided between the two houses. Within the two houses, there are supermajority requirements for various things, especially in the Senate. Again, this frustrates us when we have narrow majorities. And narrow majorities are the only kind we've had now for an entire generation in American political life. But the reason it's there is to force the factions of our society to work together, to deal with each other. Congress, the structure of the system, says to a narrow majority, congratulations, now deal with those people. It's not enough to win the election. Every modern president has found himself in the Oval Office thinking to himself, why am I dealing with these people? I just beat them on election day. And the answer is, they won too. They're here too. And over, the system is structured in a way that forces accommodation and bargaining and compromise when it works. When it doesn't work, that's what's not working. is we're not building coalitions, we're not looking for ways to build accommodations. Congress is at the center. I would say the presidency functions as part of this system in the sense that the president's job is to promote and produce stability and a sense of continuity. Now, I assure you I'm not joking, right? But in this moment, to think, if you read the way that Alexander Hamilton, for example, talks about the presidency, the essence of what he argues for is what he calls steady administration. We don't have that now, but we haven't had that for 2 generations. We haven't had that under Democrats. We haven't had that under Republicans. Our presidents believe that their job is simple representation. So they come in, they undo what their predecessor did, and then they do a whole bunch of stuff that their successor is going to undo. That is not the logic of the American presidency as it is intended to work. The presidency is not a representative office. It is an administrative office. It's elected to be kept accountable. But no one expected that one person would represent a vast society. We've lost sight of that almost entirely. And ultimately, because it's an administrative office, the president's job is to facilitate the environment for the kind of political culture that the Constitution envisions. And the courts finally are there to enforce the rules, to make sure that the various players in the system are following the rules of the American system of government. That's their role. That's their job. I think judges are better at knowing their job than most other actors in the American system. But everybody could use a reacquaintance with the Constitution, and I think it's time for it.
So this philosophy that underpins the Constitution, so we move forward, government starts functioning, Congress functions, bills are passed, the presidency grows, and sort of the judicial review provisions come into fold. And so the different branches of government start to sort of develop themselves under this regime. But there's always this tension in the country from day one that maybe the Madisonian view wasn't right. Maybe all of these delays and all of these speed bumps along the way are infringing or impugning the ability for the country to solve big problems. Yeah. One of maybe the biggest critics of sort of the way this is drafted would be Woodrow Wilson. Wilsonian had a much different view of, and as did others in the drafting of the Constitution. What is that view? And maybe present that in its best light. What did they believe?
Yeah, I think it's important to know that view because that's been the critique of the Constitution from the very beginning. And the fundamental criticism is this is too slow, it's too cumbersome, it puts too many obstacles in the way of necessary change. That is not a crazy view, and it is the view that dominates just about every other democracy in the world. But I do think that it is ultimately a mistaken view in thinking about how the American system of government could function. Woodrow Wilson, in a way, brings these arguments together. They were there from the very beginning. You can find them in the Anti-Federalists, who argued that the Constitution was not democratic enough, that it was not accountable enough, it empowered elites too much, that the balance between the need for democratic representation and the need for functional governments hadn't been achieved. Woodrow Wilson is a political scientist who becomes president. And it is as a political scientist that he offers a robust criticism of the American Constitution. He's really the first of our presidents who openly criticized and really almost opposed the American Constitution as he found it. And his fundamental argument is based on the model of the parliamentary government, of the Westminster system that you'd find in Britain. In Britain, the party that wins a majority in Parliament has all the power until it loses its majority. You win the election, you are the government until you lose your majority in Parliament. Wilson's view was this is how democracy should work. The people have spoken. Their representatives should do what they said. If they fail, there'll be another election and they go away. As I said, that's not a crazy view. The problem with that view is that it does allow majorities to trample minorities, and it creates disincentives rather than incentives for building cross-partisan coalitions, coalitions across lines of difference in American political life. That argument for efficiency over legitimacy remains a very powerful argument in American political life. Wilson's argument was Congress should be more centralized, the power should be in the hands of party leaders, rather than all this chaos of committees and all that, and the system as a whole should be more centralized with power in the hands of the president. The president is the representative of the public will, and he should be in charge of our system. This may sound familiar to you, both of these arguments, because in fact the American system has moved in a Wilsonian direction gradually for 100 years, and I would say very quickly over the last 25 years or so. It's done it under both parties. And it's done it because of the kind of worry that Woodrow Wilson expressed, which is, we won the election and we can't do anything. It's too slow. It's not allowing us to be responsive and representative. The American system says to those people, win bigger, persuade more people, build bigger majorities. In the 21st century, our political leaders have not responded to that incentive. They think of winning as 50% plus one voter, and then I should get to do everything I want. And you win 49% of the vote, and you come in saying this was the biggest win ever, and now we should do everything. The last 3 presidents we've had have done exactly that. They've won pluralities, if that, and not always that. And then they've come in and said, it's a new day, it's a new age, we run everything now. The Constitution says to them, no, you have the smallest congressional majority in the history of the United States. That was true for Joe Biden, it's true for Donald Trump. And that means you should deal with the other party. Come in and ask yourself, who are 30 people from the other party who might agree to something that I could sign? That is not how our presidents think. It's not how Congress works now. I think that Wilsonian argument remains very strong, and it's deformed our system in ways that we have to recover from. We have to restore our acquaintance with the Madisonian Constitution so that we can see just what it is that's wrong, because otherwise it's not obvious what's wrong. I'll say one quick thing about this. Everybody agrees that Congress is dysfunctional. I don't think it would be hard to get a consensus agreement around that. But what is the function that Congress is failing to perform? I think most people naturally would say, it's just not passing big bills. The things I want aren't getting done. I think what Congress is failing to do is to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. Now, that's also why it's not passing big bills. But if you think the problem is we're not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. So you want more power in the hands of leadership. You want things to move faster. You want it to break down barriers to action. If you think what Congress isn't doing is facilitating bargaining and accommodation, you want Congress to be less efficient. You want there to be more barriers to small, little, tiny majorities doing whatever they want, and more reasons to talk to the other party. You love the filibuster, as I love the filibuster. It's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 20 years. The idea that the solution to our problems is to get rid of the filibuster, I think, requires blindness to the problem we confront. And there is a lot of that blindness around. So I think recovering an appreciation of what the Constitution was meant to do could help us see just what's wrong. Not that something is wrong, we all know that, but what is it and what can we do about it is the question for us.
So the sort of philosophy here, I think, that you really uncover is maybe counterintuitive to all of us, because when my side wins, we achieve that win, we want to go do, I want a strong presidency, right? I want that president to go do it he or she wants. And when the other side wins, they want their presidency to go do it. And I think what you're laying out in your book is that's precisely, that may be where our gut takes us, but that our head should tell us that's just making the problem worse. And there's this sense that our lack of unity means that we need to reform and create a stronger majoritarianism approach because we're too divided, and so we need someone to lead and lead us through this, when the reality is that's what may be creating the lack of unity. And I noticed in your book you talk about the framers sort of saying not only are these principles to protect minority rights, they're actually to legitimize majority rule. Exactly. Because without that, you don't have long staying power of legislation. To your point, one president undoes what the previous president had done, and we're sort of in an endless series of almost, some have called it revenge politics. You guys did it, now we're going to do it. And so, understanding that, right, is I think a key part of your book. We have to understand this in order to identify how to fix it. So what are some of those fixes? And you talk a lot about a broken Congress, and I've not taken offense to that as a former member of Congress. But I think that is, to your point, maybe one of the points of great unity in this country. And so I guess talk about sort of forward-looking. We've sort of identified the framework, why it's important, why our impulses may be misdirected. How do we redirect, and what do we need to do, and what do we need our leaders to do for us?
Yeah. Let me stress to begin with something very important in your question, which is there's a tendency to combine, to confound what I think of as constitutional structure on the one hand and policy substance on the other, so that we think all that matters is the policy outcome. So when my party elects, when our leader is president, then we think, well, we love the presidency and we hate Congress. Congress is just in his way. Let's have a strong president. And then the other party wins a presidential election, and suddenly you discover that, well, actually, it's very important that presidential power be constrained. And, you know, the Democrats love federalism now, and suddenly the Republicans love presidential power. Interesting. I think it's very important to distinguish these process questions from substance questions. All of us are going to find ourselves in the minority at some point. This is a very important insight of the American constitutional system. It is crucial to remember. Think when you're arguing yourself into the view that the elected official you like should have a lot more power, ask yourself, what is this going to look like when the other party has this power? If you're creating some new thing and saying the president can do whatever he wants, what is it going to look like when a president you really don't like is doing exactly the same thing? That is the root of the argument for limits on government power. It's not some abstract ideology that says government is bad. It's the simple fact that we will all find ourselves in the minority, and we should all value minority protections and a system that allows the minority party to have some role in figuring out how we solve our problems. That's the essence of the logic of the American Constitution. And again, it is different from how most democracies work. And I think for our situation, it is better. So when we think about how to solve problems in Congress, the kinds of practical solutions that I point toward in the book are about recovering the capacity of the institution to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and negotiation. Congress has been through now 50 years of centralizing power in the hands of party leaders, to the point where there are about 4 people in Congress who really run the place, and they make the big decisions. Legislation ends up often being written at midnight before a government shutdown in the Speaker's office. And most members are not wrong to think that they're wasting their time by specializing in some policy expertise or going to committee meetings. It's not entirely true. There are lower salience things that do get done, and it matters. But the big things don't work that way enough. And we have to change the incentives they face. Members of Congress are smart, ambitious men and women. They will do what it takes to succeed. The system answers for them the question, what does it take to succeed? Right now, the answer is something like, get a big social media following. And members of Congress are really good at that. They're going to be really good at whatever the answer is. And so they've figured out that in order to succeed, they need to become celebrities. And that's the work that especially younger members who don't know a different Congress are engaged in. If the answer was more like, in order to succeed, you have to effectively bring some benefits to your constituents, you have to be part of addressing large public problems, then they would invest themselves more in that. So I argue for things like allowing the committees to control floor time in the House and Senate. It's a very mundane reform. It's actually done in most state legislatures now, a majority of state legislatures as of last year. And it would make a dramatic difference in the culture of the Congress if members believed that what they were doing in committee would actually get voted on the floor, rather than only if the speaker likes it will it ever get a vote. A small, simple change. Simple changes like that, changing the House calendar so that, and you'll know about this, that members spend time with each other. Have several weeks in a row where members are in Washington and then several weeks when they go home, rather than the schedule we've had since the 1990s where they're in town between Tuesday and Thursday and then they're home and they don't know each other at all. That kind of small change could make a massive difference. I think these kinds of changes, as long as you recognize that the purpose is to facilitate bargaining, to let these people deal with each other, rather than facilitate a system where deal-making is seen as a betrayal or a failure of nerve. A lot of members now are treated that way. If they deal with the other party, they're treated by their own primary voters as failing to do their job. The party in power in Congress will throw out the speaker for making a budget deal with the other party. That is the speaker's job description. And as long as the incentives are so misaligned with the structure of the institution, our political culture will break down. So I think those kinds of seemingly small changes are the way to start.
You also talk in your book about sort of restraint, too, on behalf of leaders. And so, you know, at the end of the day, the Constitution is going to be as effective as the people who are leading our country. And so, you know, I think one thing you talk about both parties, sort of this concept of when we're in power, what do we do to ensure that we're setting the framework for when we're not in power? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that sort of individual restraint is difficult in a time in which we're sort of in We talk about sort of celebrity politics or cable news politics. Yeah. I noticed during my time in Congress that really rapidly escalate social media. There was this famous saying by Tip O'Neill when he was Speaker that all politics is local. Now everything's national. I think you make your point in the book that we're more likely to know what's going on in our national capital than we are in our state capital. Right. So talk a bit about maybe federalism and localism and sort of citizenship and how all that sort of plays to our solutions.
I think it is very important to see, and this was plain in the language of the authors of the Constitution, but we've lost sight of it. They lost sight of it pretty quickly too. The most important office in our system of government is not president, but citizen. And ultimately, the system cannot support itself if everyday citizens don't think of this system of government as our responsibility. It's not, we don't solve problems by folding our arms and wondering when somebody's going to show up to fix them. We solve problems by rolling up our sleeve and fixing them. And Americans do that. We still do have that in our character. But I do think that it's been diminished by the nationalization of politics, by changing attitudes about the role of civil society, the role of government. I think it's very important to recover the sense that most governing happens at the local level. This is just true. And that the most important ways in which we can make a difference are interpersonal and direct. We are the owners of this society. American politics happens in the first person plural. The first word of the Constitution is we, and not they. And so we can't approach our politics as spectators. We have to approach it as active citizens. Yes, that means voting. Voting is crucial, but there's a lot more than voting. And a lot of the problems we face could be addressed by people like us, which may mean us, where we are at the local level. And I think that allowing our politics to get nationalized, and this is really happening at every level now. Where I live in Maryland, there are people who run for county commission on a platform that's about immigration. Now, it's vaguely interesting to me what they think about immigration, but they can't do anything about immigration in the job they're running for. Tell me what you're going to do about transportation in the county, maybe, right? Thinking that way would also allow them to find more ways of working together across lines of difference. They're not going to agree about immigration, but you know what? They don't have to. I'm not asking them about immigration. Local government can work in a way that national government sometimes can't. And I think we have to use that internal diversity, the fact of federalism, the decentralized character of our society, as a strength and not a weakness, and allow power to flow from the bottom up and not the top down.
One reform you had in the book that might be counterintuitive, it was to me at first, and then reading through it, it makes a lot of sense that I think would be interesting to share with the audience, is the participation in partisan politics. And many of us feel like our parties don't represent us, that neither party does, that we're becoming more independent. You see independent registration on the rise, you see partisan registration on the downturn. Yet we have a two-party system. You talk about Martin Van Buren, the father of the political party system. Some folks might think, well, maybe part of the answer is let's get parties out of this. Why would that actually be a mistake, and how could our participation in party politics actually improve the system?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up Martin Van Buren. That's a very rare thing, and I really love Martin Van Buren. You would find in this book that I'm a big fan. Partisanship is one of those things that you can watch the framers of the Constitution learn about as they go. Their attitude at the outset was like the attitude of a lot of Americans now. Parties are a problem. Partisanship is bad. Parties represent partisanship, so let's get rid of parties. And almost as soon as the system started actually working, they all realized immediately, well, we need political parties. We need some way to organize this thing. We need some way to decide who's going to run for office. We need some way to divide for voters the universe of political options into some discernible, plausible choices. And the American system in particular, because of the character of the Electoral College, which says that to be elected president you need an absolute majority of electors, has meant from the very beginning that we've basically had two parties. If you have more than two serious candidates for president, no one's going to win, and the election will go to the House, and that creates enormous legitimacy problems. It happened twice in the 19th century, and then the party system got going, and it has not happened since. The party system is there to prevent that, but it's also there to facilitate the logic of our politics, to start coalition building before you even get into government. A system with two large parties is a system where coalition building happens in the parties as well as between the parties, in the institutions as well as before you arrive at the institutions. And parties as strong institutions are actually absolutely essential for a functional politics. We get very partisan when our parties are weak, not when they're strong. And right now, our parties are very weak. Our parties are just platforms for performers to stand on and talk. They don't have real power. They don't actually decide who their candidates are. That's been handed over to primary electorates. And so the primaries are a part of the political culture problem we have now. They're not a good fit for 21st century American political culture. Basically, if you think about it, we start every election cycle by asking the craziest people in America, who do you want to see? And then after that, we have our politics. And look, I'm one of those. I vote in primaries, but people who vote in primaries spend way too much time thinking about politics. They're purists. They tend not to like compromise and bargaining. And that's the wrong attitude to have about American politics. The parties want to win general elections. And right now, they should both see that primaries are actually standing in their way of winning general elections. They've both, many times over the last 30 years, ended up running people in the general election who are just not attractive to the general electorate and who are obviously not attractive. And over, American voters end up in a place where they think, which one of these people is a little less bad than the other? Because, boy, they're both really bad. That's a failure of the party system. And what it requires is stronger parties as institutions who think our job is to narrow down the options before the public and to bring some order to the logic of the American political system, to build coalitions. Coalition builders are going to be effective in American institutions. We don't have enough coalition builders in our politics, and we don't have enough coalitions being built in our politics. Some of the blame for that belongs to the weakness of our parties. So rather than weaken them further, and take more of their control of money away, as we're talking about doing again amazingly, rather than take away their ability to choose candidates, we have to move somewhat in the other direction and allow parties as institutions to play a significant role in our politics now. And we should all get to know Martin Van Buren, the father of the American party system.
All right. Well, we have time for a few questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to ask a question, yeah, there we go. So hop up and we'll get a line going, and try to keep your question brief, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Sir.
Hi. Before I get to my question, I just wanted to comment on Mr. Levin's assertion that the last 4 or 5 presidents have made no attempt to reach out to the other party. Clinton had a Republican as a defense secretary, not Secretary of War, but defense secretary, and then following him, Obama continued the defense secretary which George Bush used. And when it comes to Biden, he didn't appoint anyone from the other party, but sure, I mean, he could not have passed the infrastructure bill without help from the old style Republicans like Mitt Romney and others who are all being primaried out. So that's one comment I have. The question I have is, within a few weeks of this administration taking office, the words on everyone's mind was constitutional crisis. We don't hear that now, but for all of February, March, that's all we kept hearing, because there were a slew of lower courts which are ruling against the party and against the administration, and the defiant this thing was that we will not follow it, and we were fearful of that. So
your question, sir.
Yeah, the question is, you can't expect the Constitution to resolve a constitutional crisis in oxymoron. So what's the solution?
All right, great. Let me say a few things. The tendency of American presidents to reach across party lines to advance legislation has diminished pretty dramatically over the past generation. Now, it's not that there was none, but there wasn't much. And what we saw with the filibuster bill, what we saw with the infrastructure bill was a function of the filibuster. And I'm very grateful for the filibuster. As I say, it has forced several of our recent presidents to reach across party lines to advance important legislation. But I think there's just no way around the fact that the tendency to do that, to come in and say, who are 50 members of the other party I can work with on this bill, is not how presidents now start out. And it's true, we were doing that more 30 years ago than we are now. but we were already doing that less 30 years ago than we had been for a while. And I think the tendency to see that decline is just a fact of American political culture over the past generation that we have to contend with. And it's crucial to see why it's important to begin by reaching out. Ultimately, you can't do much that is durable if you fail to do that. On the question of constitutional crisis, I would only say quickly, the Constitution envisions our politics operating through conflict. And so the fact of tension between the branches is not itself a crisis. I would argue, in fact, the opposite. The absence of tension is where we run into the most problems. And I think that's where we're now witnessing a problem that I think is beginning to verge on a constitutional crisis. It's not that there's too much combat between the president and the courts. It's that there's not nearly enough tension between the president and Congress. The unwillingness of Congress. And this, too, we have seen with both parties. The Democrats did this when their presidents are in power, and the Republicans are doing it now. The sense that, well, Congress's job is to support the president when he's in power is not how the Constitution works. And the notion that a president can just come in and do things that Congress can't do because majorities are too narrow is not how the Constitution works. So not on immigration, not on student loans, not on national security. And again, our last 4 or 5 presidents have behaved this way because Congress has let them. And I think the biggest problem we face is not presidential hyperactivity. That's a problem. It's not judicial overreach. That happens too. The biggest problem is congressional underactivity. And unless we resolve that problem, we do not have a way forward.
Sir.
So my question directs primarily to your philosophy about federalism and coalition building in Congress. And through that lens, something that's kind of a lot of people see as far off, but I think it's interconnected, and I'm hoping that you would see it as well that way, and to see how it does connect to your philosophies, the issues of states' rights.
Yeah.
And particularly not only like states' rights in terms of states, how they act independently and how they also act in conjunction with carrot stick, with the government, the federal government, and primarily the very big issue that does not get enough headlines these days is gerrymandering. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering how that fits into your philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I think gerrymandering gets now a lot of headlines, but I agree with you. I think, so let me say a few things. The fundamental logic of federalism in our system is a logic of separation. The Constitutional Convention had to deal with the question, are we creating a national government that governs the people directly, or do the states keep governing the people directly and the national government only resolves problems between them? They couldn't solve that disagreement, and they just ended up doing both. The states and the national government both govern the people directly, but they do it in different arenas. The federal government does it when it comes to economic policy and when it comes to national security, and since the post-Civil War amendments, also in securing equal rights to Americans in different parts of the country. The states run everything else, or they should. A lot of what we've done in federalism in the last few decades now is an entanglement of federal power and state power in welfare, in healthcare, in education. They try to govern together, and I don't think that's a functional way to address our problems. So that federalism reform would have to involve now a lot of untangling of state and federal power. Our election system is decentralized, and the Constitution gives the states control over how House seats are allocated. I think, obviously, the states need to think about doing that in a way that accounts for the reality we talked about before, that everyone will eventually find themselves in the minority, and think about the ways in which politics plays into the allocation of House seats. Again, both parties, I mean, you know, the 2 most gerrymandered states are Illinois and my home state of Maryland. They are unbelievably distorted by gerrymandering in policy. We're now seeing that happen in Texas. We're seeing that happen in other places. Generally speaking, I don't think it's a turn for the better. But the Constitution empowers that to be a state issue, and I think it has to be fought out in the politics of our states.
Yuval, thank you for for writing this book. Thanks for creating this conversation. I think this is the kind of dialogue and the introspection we have to have as a country if we're going to become more unified. So
thank you, and thank you all very much for being here.
Round of applause.